What is up, Catella Human Geography? Mr. Majewski in the house. I will be covering development and the development review questions today. I'm going to get right into it today. So, unfortunately, my finished review sheet with the answers already on that is not coming across on the video very well. So I'm just going to go through the answers. I am going to go line by line with them, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Google Doc so that if you would like, you can kind of, I guess we'll call crowdsource it, where you can work with other students to create a Google document that will kind of be a group combined effort for review. All right, so that might be a way for you to work with other people to create the very best study guide if you want to work with others in helping to formulate these answers. So let's begin with number one. What is development? Well, I would ask that you go to the very first slide that we had on this unit. The what is development is the very first slide and the very first set of slides. Development is the process of improving the material conditions, right? So the wealth, the living situation, the material situation of people through the diffusion of both knowledge and technology. All right, so it's kind of an inclusive definition. Again, the improving the material conditions of people through the diffusion of knowledge and technology. All right, so when knowledge spreads, when technology spreads, that generally leads to an improved material condition for people, which means higher wages, better living conditions, better working conditions, better family conditions, better housing. All of these kind of feed together. What is an MDC and how does it compare to an LDC? Well, remember, MDC is a developed country. It used to be called a more developed country. It's obviously going to have higher levels of development than an LDC, also known as a developing country, which clearly is going to have lower results according to that definition. So they would have, an MDC is going to have higher material conditions and going to have more diffusion of knowledge and technology throughout society, whereas an LDC will have less of those two things. Now, number two. What are the two primary ways that a country's development can be measured? Well, the two primary ways that you're able to measure the development of a country is their overall human development, that's the measure of everybody in their country, or you could measure them through gender development. All right, so it could be human or it could be gender. Those would be the two primary ways. And of course, when we're measuring those things, we're talking about, hey, what's the overall level of people on average in that country? And if we're measuring gender, obviously we're focusing on the development of women and girls in that country compared to men and boys. All right, both of them are good ways to measure the development of a place. Some geographers believe humans a little bit better. Others tend to value gender development a little more. Second part of that question is, what are the main development indexes that have been created by the UN to measure development? Okay, well, like I told you, the indicator, or I should say the index that's used to measure overall human development is going to be HDI, the Human Development Index, right? And that, of course, is created by the UN, as well as the Gender Development Index. I should say the Gender Inequality Index, which is a new index that was created by the UN to measure the overall equality that exists in a place between, again, males and females. Now, those aren't the only two indexes the UN has. There's a bunch of other ones. We used to use something called the GDI, which was a lot like gender, which is a lot like HDI. But now we've moved over to GII instead. So again, the HDI is really going to measure the overall development level of everybody within a country on average. The GII is really going to measure the development of a country based on the differences or the inequalities between men and women, boys and girls. Okay? Now the next question is, how? Number three. How do these indexes work? What are they measuring? How does each of these development indexes actually measure the development inside of a country? I kind of already mentioned that in my explanation. I guess I was going a little too fast. HDI measures overall development of all people in a country, right? So the overall material conditions of everybody through the diffusion of knowledge and technology to everybody. And again, it's going to generally be displayed as averages or percentages in most categories. And GII is obviously going to measure differences that exist, right, between men and women and boys and girls. Men and women or boys and girls. And it as a measure or a way for us to understand overall gender development. All right, so again, kind of explains how those two things work. And kind of helps us to figure all that good stuff out. So we are asking ourselves, and oh, by the way, back to number 3 again, HDI uses economic, social, and demographic or health indicators in order to determine their results. So they take a look at a country's economy, a country's social development, and a country's health or demographics in order to come to their conclusions. GII also uses economic, and they also use demographic or health, but they focus on empowerment of women, ways to measure how much power women have in a particular country compared to other places. So now specifically for number 4, what's the indicators used by HDI to measure development in a country? Well, there's one economic indicator, and that is GNI per capita. Remember, that's a measure of the overall amount of economic production in a country per person per year. So it kind of gives you a super rough, crude estimate of the total kind of economic value of each person in a country. Almost like a rough estimate of about how much a person would make there. It's higher in MDCs, usually over $30,000. Usually a lot higher than that, maybe $40,000 or $50,000 in many MDCs per person. It's lower in LDCs. Let me fix that. It's lower in LDCs. It's going to be less than 10,000, oftentimes much lower than that. All right, so GNI per capita, your first indicator used by HDI. Your 2 social indicators have to do with education. There is the average amount of education that a 25-year-old has gotten in that country. That's called the average years of ed. And then there's expected years. That's the amount that we could expect a 5-year-old in that country to receive starting today. So both of those education measures are used by HDI to come up with their estimate of the HDI of each particular country. Numbers are obviously going to be higher in MDCs where schools and school resources and the ability to send kids to school has improved. They're going to be 12 or higher in many MDCs. In LDCs, maybe 10 years or less or fewer because obviously families are dealing with sending their kids to school less in order to provide for other needs associated with that group. Demographics, the one indicator that is used by HDI is life expectancy. That's the average number of years that a person born there today would live. It's obviously going to be a little higher in MDCs, a lot higher, usually around 80 years in the best MDCs or older, and it's much lower in LDCs. Why do I keep doing that? In LDCs, your ages are going to usually hover maybe between around 60. So all told, it's going to be about a 20-year difference in life expectancy from the most developed to the least developed places in the world. Again, those are the 4 indicators that are used by HDI. Number 5, what are some other indicators that are not used by HDI or GII to measure development? Well, we start with job types. Remember, job types can tell us the overall development in a country. Are they primary, are they secondary, or are they tertiary? Remember, MDCs are going to have more tertiary, and they're going to have fewer primary and secondary than an LDC would. So that's look at primary jobs, look at secondary jobs. That'll tell you a lot of times. If there seems like there's more for one country over another by a decent amount, then that means that country is probably the LDC. If there's few primary jobs, few secondary, and mostly tertiary jobs, then that generally means MDC. Alrighty? And of course, this is because as a country industrializes, as they go through this process, they don't need as many people working in agriculture or mining. They have machines and other resources to do the jobs instead. And so far fewer people work in those industries, once you are fully industrialized, once you are fully developed. Instead, we tend to provide services for one another. Second measure is productivity. Remember, this is measured with something called value added. This is a measure of manufacturing in a country. It's the overall value of the total manufacturing that's occurring within a country per person. So they take all the products that they make, then they subtract the costs, including energy, and then they add up the difference for every product that is constructed. At the end of the year, they take that amount, they divide it by the number of people, and that tells you your value added, which again is the cost of it's the value of all manufacturing in your country minus costs, including energy and labor that are associated with it. It is only used to measure manufacturing growth. GNI is used to measure overall economic production from everybody. Value added is only used to measure the productivity of your manufacturing sector, your industry. So it doesn't include services, it doesn't include things like primary sector jobs like agriculture. Okay? But since industrialization and manufacturing is considered key to moving through the development process, generally speaking, the more value added you have, the higher value goods you're producing, the more goods you're producing, and that's generally a good sign for your overall development. And then finally, consumer goods. Remember, consumer goods are where we take a look at motor vehicles, right? In a country, I spelled that wrong. We take a look at cell phones, right? And then we take a look at the number of internet/computer users. All of these are considered especially valuable for economic development because motor vehicles obviously allow goods and people to move around more quickly and more efficiently, which means more products get bought and sold, more people tend to buy and sell products, and more people are making their way to regular jobs. Cell phones obviously connect buyers to sellers. They allow for transactions to take place over large distances, which is a serious boost to the overall trade within your country. Internet computer, same deal. You can buy and sell products far distances away. You no longer have to be face-to-face with the salesperson. This makes things significantly easier for your economy to grow and develop into a MDC type economy. Let's get to what are the social indicators that are not used by HDI to measure development, but could be. Well, literacy rate. Remember, literacy rate is a measure of the overall people in your country that can read it and write at a very basic level. Usually in MDCs, remember, the numbers are at or above 99%. In LDCs, well, the reality of it is it's usually lower than 90, and in many places it can be even far lower to 80 to 70, even into the 60% range. Think about this. This is a real measure of your overall social development, because if you're not able to read and write at a basic level, that's one, going to deny you a lot of opportunities and access not only to jobs but also goods and services that you otherwise wouldn't be available to you. In addition to that, keep in mind, in order to function in many developed countries with news media, with commercials, with television programs, with movies, you're going to obviously need to be able to function at a basic level, literacy-wise, in order to understand and to fully appreciate these innovations within a developed country. Student-to-teacher ratio, remember what we know now is that the lower number of students in a classroom, generally the more learning that takes place, and so MDCs do a better job of keeping the student-to-teacher ratios low, all right? For instance, if you remember, in many places the number of kindergartners per teacher is about 12 or 13 in MDCs, whereas LDCs, the numbers usually double. For instance, it would be about 26 students or higher for every teacher in the country. Those are both good measures of overall social development of society as a whole, and obviously education is considered a really great measure of the overall societal developmental growth. Let's get to demographic or health indicators. There's a lot we could use. Infant mortality, obviously, is the number of infants that are not making it to 1 year old. We know IMR is a effect of medical care, medical treatment, preventative medicine, access to medicine, number of doctors, number of nurses, number of hospitals, amount of vitamins, the amount of immunizations. All of these things play a role in infant mortality rate. And the infant mortality rate out of 1,000 births in many MDCs is going to be less than 5. Whereas in many that's in MDCs. Whereas in LDCs, it's usually going to be greater. All right, usually I would say about 10 plus per every 1,000. So there's a big noticeable difference between the two results, as LDCs struggle more to use their money effectively or to provide medical care, medical access at a level that meets the needs of their growing populations. Total fertility rate is the number of babies that women are having in a country. Obviously, in MDCs, that number is going to be lower. Maybe 2 kids per family, whereas in LDCs it'll be higher, on average closer to 6 children per family. There's a number of reasons why. One, there might be a lack of access to birth control, all right, to regular birth control. Secondly, in MDCs, generally children, people have less children. They wait longer to have their kids. They have fewer kids when they do have them. This has a lot to do with the fact that women oftentimes delay pregnancies to pursue education or pursue careers. Whereas in LDCs, because women don't have the same levels of opportunity, we don't see that as much. Also, in LDCs, remember, women have a responsibility oftentimes to have more kids to make up maybe for losses along the way, especially in the lowest LDCs where children are essentially workers for the family, especially on the family farm. Then remember, the percentage of your GNI that is spent on health, obviously higher in MDCs, lower in LDCs. Again, why? Well, because MDCs have more income to spend. They have their money's able to be spread around more easily. And so they tend to spend higher percentages on health because they can afford to do so. LDCs are still focusing on food acquisition. They are still focusing maybe on defense and security. They're focusing more on the basics. And so therefore, they're able to spend a smaller percentage of their overall wealth on healthcare and medical services. Questions? I will take them at any time throughout this review session. So, what are the indicators used in GII to measure development inside of a country, and what are the differences between MDCs and LDCs? Okay, so like I told you, GII uses 3 categories of indicators. First, economic. The economic indicator they use is labor force participation. They compare the percentage of men working in a economy to women, and specifically people that are working for a wage. So take home money, not just to provide for themselves. Obviously, this is going to be more in an MDC. It's going to be closer. So the difference between men and women is going to be more even in an MDC. And the gap between men and women's employment will be wider in an LDC. The reason for that, of course, is remember, the more children you're having, right, the less opportunity or likelihood it is that you're working outside of the home. Women in LDCs tend to have more children for reasons we talked about above. On top of that, there might be cultural taboos or a lack of education or experience that prevents women from taking a job in the labor force. There could be cultural blocks, like, for instance, a belief woman's place is in the home, providing for the children, especially if there is a large family at home as well. So all of those factors are used by GII. They think it's a good measure of the overall equality between men and women in a country based on their working percentages. Next up is empowerment. Two indicators used in empowerment. The first is the number of women in the legislature. That's like Congress for us. Higher in MDCs, lower in LDCs, right? Why? Well, because remember, women in legislature, in political positions, are decision makers for the rest of us. Usually it requires a lot of experience and or education. Oftentimes those can only be reached commonly in MDCs, or it's easier to reach them there. So you see higher numbers of women pursuing positions of power and authority and succeeding. In LDCs, there still are some. There's just less likelihood or fewer numbers that are able to achieve those tremendous results. The second measure of empowerment, remember, is the percentage of women with post-secondary education. So the percentage of women that have college education of some type. And again, for the reasons we talked about above with labor force, it's pretty much the same thing. In order for women to achieve the highest positions and positions of authority and wealth in a society, they have to have the skills, the education, the training in order to do so. Oftentimes this might require them to not only go to college, but to finish college and succeed. Because of this, oftentimes MDCs have higher percentages of women that are able to do so. Health. Health is the third category used by GII. And again, they use two different indicators. The first is maternal mortality rate. Of course, that's the number of women that die during childbirth. It's going to be higher in LDCs. It's going to be lower in MDCs. We already talked about the medical care, access, and facility is above. All of those play a part in keeping maternal mortality rates lower. In MDCs, they're higher in LDCs. Also, women have fewer kids in MDCs, and so as a result, there's usually fewer complications and issues with the woman when that occurs. Adolescent fertility rate is teen girls having infants, having babies. So it's the number of teen girls that are having babies in a country compared to the total number of births, of overall births. Obviously higher in LDCs, lower in MDCs. Again, let's remember, women might be in getting married earlier. They might be having children earlier in LDCs. There's more pressure on them to have children and more of them to meet the needs of the family. There's a lack of birth control, and especially a lack of access to birth control oftentimes. There might be cultural or educational blocks or taboos against those things. And so therefore we see higher frequencies of adolescent pregnancy in LDCs. This is important because remember, again, why is it considered a health factor? Because oftentimes infants that are born to older moms or to younger moms or to moms that have had a lot of kids tend to have more complications, not only for the infant itself, but also for the mother. So again, those are our measures used by GII. Let's jump down to number 9. Number 9, be able to analyze, compare, and contrast development results in two countries related to HDI, GII. Okay, well, obviously you're going to need to know the differences between the indicators we just talked about. So if I gave you the same indicators for two countries, which one's the MDC, which one's the LDC, based on the above indicators I just mentioned, you would need to be able to identify them. More generally, remember, perfect HDI is 1.0. So great HDI is like 0.9 or 0.95. It's as close as possible to 1.0 that you can get. Bad HDI, bad HDI is closer to 0. It's 0.0. That's the worst possible HDI you could have. Nobody's there. But obviously, like 0.3s or 0.4s, the closer you are to 0.0, the worse your HDI is. The closer you are to 1.0, the better your HDI is. Remember, with GII, it's the opposite. Because with GII, we're measuring inequality. So if your inequality is 0.0, that means men and women are perfectly equal in your country. So countries that are very close to that, 0.05 or 0.1, are considered to have better GII and better equality than a country that has a higher number. So it's the reverse of how HDI works. High HDI close to 1, awesome country for development. HDI close to 0, horrible country for development. GII close to 0, awesome country for equality. GII way above or beyond 0, that's a terrible country for equality. Number 10, you need to know your development regions of the world, and along with two of most and two least developed regions. Well, first off, I have the regions already divided by developed and developing. So that'll make it a little bit easier. And then I've just underlined the top 2 in each category. But, again, let me see if I can bullet these bad boys and girls. There we go. Okay. So, North America, Oceania, Europe, and Japan are considered developed regions. They are fully developed. They've reached a certain level where a large majority of those people, compared to the rest of the world, are experiencing higher material conditions through knowledge and technology. The 2 most developed regions in the world are Oceania first and North America. Now, hey, please remember, when it comes to development, they both only have 2 countries in them, which helps. Regions like Europe that have 50 countries in them, actually have some of the highest HDIs in the world, but they also have lower HDIs spread in with them that drives down their overall average a little bit. So interestingly enough, kind of the most developed countries in the world are located in Europe. It's just Western Europe is really developed. Northern Europe is really developed, but Southern and Eastern Europe are less developed. So they're in the 0.8s and 0.7s, whereas Western and Northern Europe are in the 0.9s and above. You take all those countries together, you add them up, and Europe technically has a 0.87 HDI, which is lower than North America and Oceania, which are both over 0.9. Lowest HDI is definitely Sub-Saharan Africa. Remember, their HDI is usually about 0.46 or 0.47, so it's about half the number that you see in Oceania. And then the next one is South Asia. Now, South Asia is where India is located, and they have the 2nd largest population. They have kind of an out-of-control population in terms of growth. They're also mixed in there with Bangladesh, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. So huge population, not a ton of natural resources, very behind the rest of the world in terms of industrial growth. So those two regions by far are the lowest. Sub-Saharan Africa is 0.46, South Asia is 0.54. That means the overall material conditions, quality of life in those places generally is much lower than it is anywhere else in the rest of the world. The other developing regions that you need to know: Central Asia, Southwest Asia, and North Africa. Those are our 2 oil areas. The problem is not all of those countries have oil. Those that do actually have European-like HDIs. Those that do not are Sub-Saharan African in terms of their levels. Then Southeast Asia, East Asia, those are countries that are rapidly growing in HDI. In fact, almost all regions are growing. But they're growing thanks a lot to their manpower, the number of people they have. They're producing a lot of cheap goods, like clothing, that can then be turned around and sold for low costs around the rest of the world. And finally, Latin America. It is developing, although I need to tell you, Latin America is the highest HDI of all the developing regions. It's got about a 0.74 HDI. So we're getting to the point where Latin America is going to need to start being maybe considered as a developed region. I'd say it's about 10, 15 years away. And then Russia. Remember, Russia was developed, although now they are down in the developing group because they've suffered with life expectancy a little bit since communism ended. Hey, you need to know where these regions are. You need to know them on a map. That's why we do the World Regions quizzes. There will be multiple questions on the test that give you a map of the world and say which of these 5 choices is the most developed, which of these 5 is the least developed. You must know the development regions, which of course means, let me see if I can find it here. That of course means you need to focus on, give me a moment. Maybe not. Maybe this is it. No. How about this? No. Did I skip it? Yes. How about there? Yeah. You need to know this map really well because you're going to get a bunch of questions where I'll just say like Region A, Region B, Region C, Region D, Region E. Which of those is the most developed? You would obviously choose Region A there. Which of those is least developed out of the ones I just chose? You would choose South Asia because that had the lowest HDI. So you must know these regions of the world. You need to know North America and Oceania as the most developed. You need to know Europe and Japan as also developed. And then you need to know the rest of the regions are developing, and of course Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia have the 2 lowest scores. Explain 2 different ways that uneven development might occur in a place. Okay, 1. Development could be uneven across a region. For instance, the one I just described, Eastern and Western Europe. Western Europe, much higher HDI levels. Eastern Europe, still recovering from communism in the 1990s and in the late 80s. And so their economies were way behind. Are they growing quickly? Yes. But their HDI scores are still lower than the Western countries, which have been capitalist for much longer and industrialized for much longer. Also, like Southwest Asia, North Africa, only some countries have oil. The same problem exists in Central Asia as well. So the countries that do have very high HDIs, like Europe or like North America, countries that don't have a lot of this oil, don't have a resource to use, they're oftentimes more like Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of their development. So again, development can be varied, can be really scattered across one region. So these are averages, remember, for a region, but it doesn't necessarily specifically describe every particular country that exists. Development can be uneven within a country as well. So not just within a region, it can be uneven in a country at the same time. For instance, remember Mexico is more developed along its border with the U.S. because of trade and business connections that have led to more economic growth in those places that border the U.S. China and Brazil, remember, are more developed along the coastline where they engage in more trade with the rest of the world, and less developed in the interior, the further away from the coastline. And finally, the U.S. is more developed in urban areas than in rural areas because obviously greater access to things like infrastructure, roads, power systems, fresh water, which obviously all can help boost your overall material growth. Number 12, what's the north-south dividing line? It's the same map here, actually. It's at about 30 degrees north, and it's a line that geographers have drawn that seems to kind of divide the globe into the industrialized or developed world and the less industrialized and less developed world. It's also known as the International Line of Labor, and again, it runs at about 30 degrees latitude, give or take, and it's used to kind of point out, hey, the developed or core regions of the world all generally are located in the northern hemispheres, and it kind of leads to this whole development of the core periphery model. Because what you could argue is the further you are from this area, the more on the edge or the periphery of development you tend to be. So the less likely it is that knowledge and technology is going to diffuse to you. It generally diffuses to the areas that are closest to the source first and foremost. Remember, there is one exception to the north-south line, that is Oceania. It is located underneath the line, but it's really the only developed region that is. All right? Next question. What are international lending organizations and why are they created? Okay, so international lending organizations, and we're going to cover this in class on Wednesday, are organizations that are created to loan money to LDC governments or businesses. They're designed to try to promote development. So if you've got a good idea to promote development in an LDC, then the UN or one of these other organizations is going to potentially give you money to build the product. If your issue is you don't have the money to make this project happen, they'll loan you the money or they'll just give it to you directly. Why? Because the UN thinks it's important that we are promoting development around the world. We want to improve everybody's quality of life. We want to improve their living circumstances so that, more growth and development and less conflict and wars break out in the future. For instance, if you had an idea to, boost economic development in a country by maybe building new roads or developing an electrical system, an electricity system, setting up cell phone towers in places where there is no cell phone access, but you didn't have the money to achieve these things, these organizations would potentially loan you the money to do so, or just give you the money because they think it's an important enough project to help boost development. Why would that benefit you? Because you're going to get the money to build your project, you're going to be able to make money off of it, and at the same time, the UN does it because they're helping to boost development in a particular country. Maybe social programs. Maybe you want to build more schools or train more teachers. Maybe you want to improve the demographics in a place with vaccination programs. You spread vaccines out more easily accessible. Maybe health education. You start training men and women or boys and girls about the basics of health to improve nutrition, to improve overall health decisions. Maybe birth control. You make it more widely available. You make it available in places where the fertility rates are really high and people don't have regular routine access or knowledge about these things. That's what an organization is. Now, hey, you might ask yourself, why not go to a bank? A lot of times banks won't loan money for these projects. They think they're risky. They're worried that people won't get their money paid back by the LDC government. So a lot of times banks won't fund LDC projects. And so the UN has stepped in and created organizations that loan money out when banks will not, because the banks consider it to be too risky. What are two lending organizations the UN has helped create? Well, they've created two. One is the World Bank. It's made up of all the countries of the world. It's an organization created by the UN, and it gets like $50 billion a year. And what it does is it loans money to people, to individuals who propose development projects in LDCs. So again, if you have a development project idea, you want it funded, but you don't have the money to make it happen yourself, you can apply to the World Bank for a loan or for funds. And they will sometimes give those to you to make the project happen because they believe it's a good opportunity to boost the development results in a particular disadvantaged place. The other major lending organization created by the UN is called the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Again, billions of dollars each year that is provided by the countries in the UN. So each country contributes to this. And what the IMF does is, instead of loaning money just for development projects, the IMF will sometimes loan money to the governments in LDCs. They'll let the governments decide how they want to spend that money to promote development. Or, if that government is struggling with debt and the UN thinks that country's economy might be on the verge of collapsing, the UN will step in. They will give an emergency loan to a country to get its finances straight so that it avoids an economic collapse, which obviously would be disastrous for the people that live in that area. Why would they do this? Because again, if we're trying to promote development, one of the ways we want to do so is by preventing economies from really falling apart and collapsing, where everybody loses their job in a country, where everybody is suddenly unable, where money no longer has much worth or value there. All that's going to do is slow down the overall development in a country that is already struggling to develop. And so that's why the IMF steps in and tries to help that government before the economy falls apart and collapses. Number 15. How do these organizations try to promote development? I've really just explained it in 13 and 14, so I'm going to jump ahead to 16. Why is there so much focus by geographers on non-renewable energy use worldwide? Okay, because as the developing world continues to develop, they rely on almost overwhelmingly on non-renewable energy. And that's energy that we don't have an unlimited amount of. And it's energy that tends to pollute the environment really badly. So for instance, developing countries rely a lot on oil and especially coal. Those are some of the biggest polluters that are out there. When MDCs like the US went through industrialization, we destroyed the environment in many places. We used way too much coal, we used way too much oil, and a lot of geographers are worried that if the LDCs follow in our footsteps and do the same things that we did, that we can run into a crisis situation where we run out of some of these resources in the future, or where the amount of pollution that is generated from them causes unbelievable worldwide harm. So, geographers really want us to focus on non-renewable energy use so that hopefully it'll convince folks to really consider more renewable sources that are generally cleaner and less harmful to the environment. What are some examples of non-renewable? I've already mentioned some to you. Coal, oil, natural gas. There's not an unlimited supply. There's a finite supply. These things take, thousands of years to develop. And of course, we use them at a much faster rate than we are replenishing them. All right? Why is energy use in developing countries so important towards future development goals? I kind of just talked about this as well. Because again, as a country develops, they use a lot of energy. And generally, The energy that we have used has been non-renewable energy, and it has caused a lot of pollution worldwide. China right now is one of the most polluted countries in the world. Yes, are they developing and industrializing rapidly? Heck yeah, they are. But at what cost to the overall environment in those places? We don't want all these developing countries that have most of the world's population to follow in our footsteps, because we're worried they'll just cause irreparable harm to the environment and to the overall health of people, not only in that country, but around the world. Which specific countries are known for using the most fossil fuels? Those are non-renewable energy. Well, remember, the countries that are generally known for it are the big developed countries like the United States, Britain, Germany. However, in more recent times, those countries have adopted more green, renewable energy sources. And so now it's the big population centers like China and India that are moving ahead and kind of starting to burn more fossil fuels or non-renewable energies than ever before. All right, for what purposes? Heating, energy, like in order to provide fuel, in order to provide heating to people, in order to build buildings and factories and homes. All of these things require energy in order to be produced. Transportation systems. The more cars you have on the road, the more fossil fuels you're going to burn. But remember, automobiles are considered one of the important consumer goods in terms of building development. So, transportation, industry, home and heating and building purposes, all of these are reasons why countries use a lot of fossil fuels. And of course, that can be especially harmful to the environment. 18, what are some examples of alternate energy sources? Solar power is considered alternate or renewable. Obviously, because we believe there to be an unlimited supply, it simply regenerates, right, at a rate that's faster than we're able to use it. Wind power, right? Because again, you're not technically using an unlimited, a limited resource. Wind obviously is a natural phenomenon that kind of is kind of limitless, right? Now obviously it's not going to work everywhere, but where it is windy, it tends to always be there as a source to be used. Hydroelectric power, that's water power. When we build dams, in order to, have those dams kind of churn out water, which then produces electricity, that's what we're talking about. So hydroelectric is water power. Think about like dams that are producing electricity for all of us. And then nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is controversial in the United States, but it's really popular around Europe and the rest of the world. It's considered one of the safest. We've, of course, had a few issues with it in the past. We had a scare in the 1970s where a nuclear power plant nearly had a major accident. Ever since then, the U.S. has really avoided nuclear energy. We're worried about, if one of these plants had an accident, would it be like a nuclear bomb going off? But all in all, it's actually considered the safest form of energy that is really out there. Last question, what are the United Nations Millennium Goals for Development? Well, in 2015, the UN created a series of goals that they wanted the world to try to achieve by 2015. The goals had to do with development. How could we boost development as quickly as possible? These Millennium Development Goals are listed on page 339 of your textbook. And they kind of just are things the UN is hoping to achieve. Now, originally they wanted them achieved by 2015. That date has come and gone, and we have not done all of these things. So the goal is now 2025. We've made a lot of progress, all right, in some of these areas, like women's education. We still got a lot of work left to do. Life expectancy has definitely gone up, but we still have a lot of work to do. And GNI has gone up. Most of these things have gone up, but, the goals are very ambitious, and so we still have a lot of those to achieve. 1, they want to eradicate poverty and hunger around the world. Well, we have done major things in that regard, but obviously we still have a large percentage of the population, 1 in 4 in many LDCs, that is still considered hungry and or living in poverty. Universal education for everybody. Obviously, we're a long way from doing that, although we're getting better. Goal 3, gender equality and empowerment for women. Obviously, moving towards that, but we're not there. Number 4, reduce child mortality, right? We don't want so many kids dying during childbirth or by the time that they are 1 or 5. Goal 5, improve maternal health, improve the health of mom. Because obviously that's a key measure of overall health in a country. And 6, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. We want to try to eradicate these, wipe them out. We've made great progress, but they are obviously still around. Goal 7, environmental sustainability. We want to use resources in a way that are sustainable, that allow for future generations to use things. This requires us to use our resources wisely, to try to manage pollution, to try to manage global warming, so that future generations are not burdened by the resource decisions that we make. And then the last one, of course, develop global partnerships for development. Develop new ways to provide aid and assistance from MDCs to LDCs to try to boost the overall development level worldwide. All right, folks, this is Mr. M. I'm signing off. Hopefully this helped you. And I will post this sheet as well for you folks to add to as you would like or as you see fit. This will be posted to the Haiku page. Hey, thanks, everybody, and thanks for tuning in.